Step 31 applies to all charities, but only if you have to record or account for transfers between individual funds. If there are no transfers between funds, you can ignore this step and carry on to the next step. There is guidance there as to what you do. And the guidance appears complicated, but it isn't. If you actually read it through carefully, it's basically quite simple. There may already be entries that you've made elsewhere in the accounts or in other steps that already populate some of these boxes. You don't have to do anything with the entries that are in the yellow boxes. What you do have to do is make sure that every column here totals to 0. If it does, then your transfers will be correctly reflected in the overall accounts. So you might have a situation where you want to transfer from unrestricted funds, so that would be a debit, debit, £20,000, and you want to convert that into the fund number 2, as a credit, because you've got a deficit on fund number 2 that you want to transfer funds to. We have 0 as the total of that column, so that's going to be correctly accounted for. There are various categories of reallocation, and there's also a catch-all at the end. Some of these relate to things that can't apply, so that they are yellow cells. So you should only enter the information in the blue cells, transferring funds from one fund to another. It will, at the end of the transfer, tell you that all these transfers have been correctly done because they've been verified and the transfers come to nil. There's only one exception. That's to do with fixed asset funds. You may or may not be using fixed asset funds. If you are using fixed asset funds, then you should enter the transfers in order to achieve the correct result. If you are not using fixed asset funds, then an error will be shown, but it is an error that you can ignore. When you're using fixed asset funds, you create a situation where you have either restricted or undesignated fixed asset funds that in aggregate equal the written down value of those fixed assets. And you will move funds about at the end of the year in order to achieve that result. This will then show that the fixed assets are funded by specific capital funds. But if you're not using fixed asset funds and an error is thrown up, then you can ignore that error. The essential thing to remember here to get your funds to balance is that each column should add to 0 after you've entered your transactions. And your transfers might be to do with right valuations, might be to do with depreciation, it might be to do with deficits, it might be to do with lawful release, it might be to do with C-Prey, or it might be something else. Use a particular column and enter your transfers in those columns. The names of these funds will be picked up from elsewhere in your accounts. When you've completed the step, enter Y at the end of the step to indicate that you have completed the step. That is the end of this step.